Okay, this week is a big week. It is also the last week I'm still in Norway. I've got the fireplace going because it got down to, according to my watch, 18 degrees Celsius today, which some people are probably looking at a bit strange, wondering why I have the fire going. Australian, nice excuse. Also, it's been a really nice environment to work in today because I've spent the last, I don't even know how many hours, since 5 something this morning, plugging away at things I'm going to talk about today, among other things. I am in Norway for another 2 days. I'm going to be heading to San Fran on Saturday. So I'm going to be in San Fran for a while doing a whole bunch of Project Svalbard stuff I'm going to talk about in a moment. I am also going to be in Vegas. I'm going to be at Black Hat and DEF CON. Actually, my first visits to those events. So if folks are around there and they want to catch up, let me know as well, because it'd be really nice to see some people on my first Vegas security thing events. And I have been to Vegas a number of times before, but never for these particular events. Right, now, I'm going to talk about some stuff. I've got my laptop over here because I've got a bunch of different stuff I want to refer to. And the first one, and we knew this was coming for a while, this is a tweet from Scott Helm 6 days ago. Looks like there's a change for EV UI in the latest Chrome Canary. Top left is Chrome 75, bottom right is Chrome 77. TLDR, the EV indicator on Chrome is being removed if the Canary version of 77 holds true when it hits, I think it's meant to be September or October. So this is really big because this is something that both Scott and I have been talking about for ages, the absolute uselessness of EV, and there are those out there who have vehemently argued to the contrary. Now, usually they are those who want to try and sell EV certificates, so there is that. But this just absolutely puts the nail in the coffin because we're now talking about the most broadly used browser on earth going, well, we're just not going to show you the difference between EV and DV. So all of these bullshit arguments about stopping phishing can finally die in a fire where they belong. Now, interestingly also, he's done a lot of side-by-side of 75, which we're on at the moment. We're on 75, aren't we? In fact, mine is telling me, I've got the little green thing today telling me to update. What are we on with Chrome? About Chrome? 75, new version ready to go. So we're getting close, getting very close. Anyway, so his tweets here, he's got, for example, Barclays. Now, Barclays in current gen Chrome shows Barclays with the EV. Barclays is a bank, for those of you not familiar with it. Banks do often have EV. Shows the full EV, Barclays PLC GB. It also shows the scheme, https://. It also shows www. Now, 77, no more EV, so just the normal padlock. No more scheme, no more www prefix. People are going to lose their minds over this. Remember, must have been about a year ago, almost a year ago, Chrome made a bunch of changes at once. They changed the UX, they got rid of the secure, they took away the green, they made it grey. As part of these changes as well, they did take away the www at the time, and I think they took away the scheme too. And some people got very upset about this, and they actually rolled back those two things very soon after. So it'll be interesting to see if it sticks or not. But this is just sort of the gradual continuation of simplifying visual indicators in UI, because most people don't know what they mean. So let's try and get rid of all the cruft and just keep the bits that we really need to focus. Now, he's showing Barclays there. That's a good example. What else is in here? Booking.com, same sort of thing. No more scheme, no more prefix. I think he said there was a change to what's actually shown with the path as well. But I'm not seeing that. It might be cut off on the width of some of these images. Regardless, this is really interesting. So, yeah, hopefully we'll get to Christmas or sometime before Christmas and this debate will just completely change, which would be really nice. Now, excuse me for all the coughing there. Let's move on to some of the real meaty bits. Pwn Passwords version 5. So I mentioned this last week. I was going to have it out that day, and I think I ended up having it out Saturday instead of Friday. And then someone said, you got problems with your NTLM hashes. I passed varchars into the NTLM hash instead of nvarchars, so it was single byte rather than double byte characters, and the output was wrong. Didn't matter too much. I just had to recalculate the NTLMs, dump it all, zip it all, upload it all, which still took 24 hours. But it was just one of those painful things. It was like, why did I screw this up? I'd rewritten a bunch of scripts. I didn't take enough time to test some of them. I pushed it out a bit early. And this is really like exactly the sort of stuff which I'm looking to offload as part of trying to find a better home for Have I Been Pwned. I've loaded a huge amount of data the last few days. I'm going to talk about those in a moment. And I want to focus on sourcing the data, communicating with the organisations, building out bigger platform features. I don't want to be the person that needs to decide whether there's an N in front of my varchar or not. Like that's work that many different people could do, and frankly, many people could do it just as well or better than me as well. So that's a really good example of sort of stuff we're trying to do with this project Svalbard, which is the sale of Have I Been Pwned. Now, on that, so that's Pwned Passwords done. I spoke about it last week, done and dusted. I'm going to San Fran on Saturday, and the way this process sort of runs, again, it's a very formal merger and acquisition process. We've got KPMG running this where they're sort of saying, look, there is a whole range of different organisations that could be a good fit for Have I Been Pwned. And we started with I can't talk about numbers, but imagine a funnel, like we started at the top of the funnel. And what's happened over time is we're gradually narrowing down the funnel. Now, one of the things we're finding as we do that is that there are organisations that get dropped off the process. And it's kind of been a bit hard for me because some of them are organisations I do have personal relationships with or people I know. And they're sort of like, hey, so why don't we get a look in now? And, I have to give sort of generic responses. It's like, look, we've got a massive range of different organisations. We're trying to find who has like the capabilities to take this thing in the direction we want, the right ethical alignment with the way I think it should work, the right resources to be able to actually invest and build things out, the right sort of subscriber bases in order to actually impact the most people possible. So there's lots of different criteria which are causing this as the funnel goes down for other organisations to drop off. Stuff next week gets into face-to-face. So I've got to spend a lot of time face-to-face with a lot of different companies next week and the week after. And that is going to be interesting. I'll tell you what, I'm looking at my schedule this morning, oh boy, I'm going to have to look after my health next week. So hopefully, I'm still cohesive by the time I do this a week from now in San Fran, because that is going to be a very, very intense period. But we are getting closer, so we'll go through that phase and then we'll start getting submissions from organisations and then we'll narrow that down further and then there'll be another round and we'll keep narrowing down. And eventually that funnel will come down to what we hope is a good selection of really good organisations that can do wonderful things and make compelling offers and all the rest of it, and I get to choose the one that works best. And I did a podcast with someone yesterday and I sort of said, the great thing about doing it this way is I get to choose. There's no duress. And I'll tell you what, if I don't find someone that I like under the right conditions, then it just won't happen at all. I think I will, because there's lots of different options out there, but I get to decide. So for everyone sort of worried about what direction it might go, I guess ultimately I'll be entirely accountable for it, given that I get to decide. But I think I'm in the best possible position to find a really great organisation and do super cool stuff. So that was the Svalbard update. Let me talk about some data breaches, because I have loaded a heap in just the last week. And what often happens with Have I Been Pwned is someone pops up and they say, hey, here's a big stash. And what I mean by big stash is multiple data breaches. I think I got about 7 from this one individual on Saturday. And they're very large, tens of millions, even 100 million plus for one of them. So I'll read you through some of these. MindJolt is online gaming. That was 28 million. I loaded that on the 13th. We had the invitations website, Evite, 101 million unique email addresses. Now, is my fire okay? Not gone out? Good. I'm new to fire of this kind. The Evite one's kind of interesting because the headlines were something along the lines of like 6 million or 4 million or something like that, like a mid-single digit figure number. And then when I pulled the data, there were 2 files. There was one which was like users and there was one which was email addresses. And what became apparent quite quickly is that the users were people who had accounts on the system. There was additional metadata around then, things like, what was there? Names, phone numbers, dates of birth, plain text passwords. This was from 2013. Still unforgivable at that time, if you ask me, but it was a while ago. So that was all there. Now, the 101 million was much larger than the number of members, because what happens is every time you send an Evite, and Evite was to do like online invitations, the email address of the person you send it to gets recorded. So you could have never heard of the service before, and then you got this random email in, like, let's say 2010 or something like that. You don't remember now, we're 9 years on, but your email address was in that system. Now there's a couple of interesting things on that. Number one is that I don't know how many people actually got notified by Evite if they just had their email address in there, because I would not be surprised, and Evite, if I've got this wrong, my apologies, but I would not be surprised if they just went through to their subscriber base and said, hey, you know, your name and date of birth and all this sort of stuff has been exposed, and didn't go through to necessarily all the people who received invitations. Because it is just an email address, but on the other hand, it's personal data, and if it was me, I'd kind of like to know as well. So that's interesting. Another thing that's interesting while I'm sort of talking about Project Svalbard and stuff I'd like to do in the future with Have I Been Pwned, is for the people who got messages, it wasn't clear to them whether they had an account, although of course they could have gone to Evite and tried to do a password reset, or if it was just an email address. And collecting that information, so effectively collecting metadata about what information about you is actually exposed, so collecting it, parsing it out, putting it in the system, building the constructs to make it searchable, would be a massive effort. And just to be clear, I don't necessarily mean putting the date of birth in the online system. Even just flagging to say, look, these are the data attributes, where's my hand? These are the data attributes that were impacted. These are the ones that were actually there against your record. So I can see why people want more of this. Now, this is, again, one of the reasons why I store the actual data from the breaches, not in the cloud, just offline, because I want the ability to do that later on if I'm in a place that's well resourced enough. So that was Evite. We also had Netlog. Netlog had 42 million email addresses. Some of you may not remember Netlog. It was a Belgium-based social media service. I would say it went somewhat broader than Belgium with 49 million email addresses. So they're out there. So that was out there. Plaintext passwords again. Thank you very much, Netlog. We also had PyZap. Many of these services I'd never heard of before. Photo editing site, 42 million unique email addresses. Also included names, genders, and where they didn't use Facebook Auth, because you did have the option of logging on with a social media provider, SHA-1 password hashes, which was not good. And this was in 2017. Like, we knew in 2017, we knew in like 2012, that SHA-1 really wasn't a good idea anymore. 38% of those already have been pwned. Shein, it's a fashion label, again, another one I hadn't heard of, another 39 million unique email addresses. MD5 hashes, this time 57% of those, and have I been pwned? This one was, I shouldn't laugh. A hacking website called Blackspigot MC, a hacking website hacked by a rival hacking website. So there was about 8.5 gigabytes worth of data there, because it was not just their data, it was their entire website web application files as well. So they're all dumped. Usernames, IP addresses, bcrypt hashes. Not something you really want if you were a person visiting the site talking about hacking things, and then it's your email address and your IP address, and you know a lot of people there are not going to be obfuscating IP addresses, and even if they were, there's other problems with that. Another story. So I'd be a bit nervous. I'd been on that site talking about hacking things. And then this morning, just today, so what do we have here? Animoto, 22 million unique email addresses, breached in July last year. Names, dates of birth, country of origin, and salted password hashes. I wasn't entirely sure whether they were SHA-256 or some key stretching variant of that, so I just said SHA salted hashes. And then what else? YouNow. So this is all just this morning. I've had a busy morning. So YouNow was another 18 million. They're a broadcasting service. Names, IPs, links to social media profiles. So fortunately no passwords, because all auth was via social providers. And then the last one just here was not about a breach. It was about the thing I'm going to talk about next, which is the Have I Been Pwned API and auth. Now, I'm going to go to my blog post here, and I'm going to sort of talk through the key points in this, because I don't want to miss anything, because this is a really, really big, significant change. And quick fire check, it's not out yet. Let's sort of go back in history. Have I Been Pwned launched in December 2013. And when I launched it, the front page always did like an asynchronous search of an API endpoint, which sat on the website, but it did the nice, don't reload the whole page thing, do a little spa kind of job. And just after it, I could just publish the API. I could just document the API and go, look, you can hit it as well. And then you can do good things with the API too, and use it to help protect the people in your company, or help your customers understand if there's been a data breach, like whatever good things. And I expected people to be nice, and they were for a while, a lot of them were. And then it must have been about 2015 era, I think it was around Ashley Madison time from memory, where I was just seeing just way too many requests hitting the service in such a way that at the time the API was running in the website itself, so it was running as part of PaaS. I'd have scale out, but it had to actually like overload the infrastructure before it went, okay, we need more PaaS. So it was causing scaling problems. It would cause outages if people hit it hard enough. And frankly, looking at the patterns of requests, I just wasn't confident enough that people were actually using it in the way that I wanted it to be used, namely to do good things. So when I see IP addresses, particularly from some certain parts of the world, which are very non-representative of where the organic traffic comes from, and where they're working alphabetically through a huge number of email addresses across all sorts of different providers, I'm starting to get a bit suspicious about the motives. So I put in rate limits. And rate limits, I wrote about at the time, and I've got links to that from this blog post, so I won't relink to those. The intent was good. It would just sort of go, hey, you've made more than one request every 1500 milliseconds I set it at. Here's a 429. You know, too many requests. Here's a retry after header which says come back in this many seconds. Job done. Everyone happy. And it didn't work real well for multiple reasons, in part because I just got totally hammered because some people obviously weren't happy with that. So I moved behind Cloudflare, and that fixed a lot of the problems. But then the longer issue that I've had to deal with is the fact that when rate limits are done by IP address, and someone has lots of IP addresses, you've got a hard problem to solve. The same actor is still managing to enumerate en masse just because they've managed to avoid the rate limit by spreading it across different entities, which is the thing being rate limited, being the IP. And the only real way to solve this is you've got to move to an entity which is consistent across that same owner of the entity, no matter which IP address they come from, and that is ultimately an auth token. So I wanted to add authentication, and I wanted to add authentication because that would mean I could start to get this under control. It would also mean that one person could, or let's say multiple people could use the same IP without having problems. So if everyone's going through the same egress node of a popular cloud service provider, and they're all hitting it once every 2 seconds for argument's sake, you're not going to have problems. You know, obviously it would be a problem if I was just rate limiting that one IP and you get lots of legitimate usage all coming from the same one. And that does happen with a lot of the big providers too. So what I was finding is that that was causing people problems. I was getting super aggressive with rate limit rules and blocking of malicious, I'll rephrase it, blocking of entities that were showing malicious behavior. That might be ASNs, sometimes it was entire countries. There are certain countries in the world which just don't represent 99% of the traffic. They represent sub 1% of the traffic, and when they suddenly represent 99% of the traffic, that's not legitimate. So to be just like, yep, ban hammer, out of the pool, you guys don't get to hit the API anymore. Some people got caught up in that when they shouldn't have. So, and I've not spoken about this much publicly because I didn't really want to show the hand, for want of a better term, show people it was something I was conscious of until I had a solution. But I've spent the better part of sort of the last 9 months to 12 months going backwards and forwards, tweaking rate limits, trying to do anti-automation tricks, just ultimately shaving the yak and not really getting anywhere in the progress, in the process of it. So, had to have API keys. Now, how do you do that? I threw around a bunch of ideas. In fact, I didn't talk about this in the blog post. I thought about using a bunch of funky Cloudflare Worker stuff and storing things like keys and hit rates and all those sort of things in persistent memory in the Cloudflare Worker, and you can do a lot of that. It's very, very cool. But there is a native construct within Azure to do this, which is Azure API Management, or APIM for short. And when I was in Seattle earlier this year for MVP-RD Summit, I actually spent a bunch of time with the folks who run that, worked on the design, got a heap of help from them, and I really want to write about what I've done with this later on as well. And basically came up with a super cool model to do rate limiting by a key. Now, here's the next problem. How do you get the key? Because if we say, okay, rate limiting by key, and bad guy comes along and then just gets 1,000 keys, well, what's the point? You've just got exactly the same problem, you've just got more moving parts to have to deal with it with. So the key provisioning was going to be important. So I wanted to make sure there was key provisioning that verified you had control of the email address you're using, which it does. You have to receive a unique link to there. I wanted to make sure that people weren't using throwaway email addresses for that. And you'll see that things like Mailinator and a whole heap of others are blocked. You can't use that. You will need to have a legitimate email address. It still wasn't quite enough though. I just wasn't confident that you wouldn't get situations like, someone sets up a Google account and then they just go, let's say it's jimbo@gmail.com, and then they just go jimbo+1@gmail.com, jimbo+2@gmail.com, and they just keep going. There needed to be more disincentive to do that. And the most obvious disincentive I could find that also solves another problem I'll come back to is financial. So there is a $3.50 a month cost to use the API. Now, how to come up with a number? I wanted a number that first of all was cheap enough that people using this legitimately to do good things won't think about it. And it's roughly what I would pay for a large latte at a coffee shop back home. Now, if the service is not worth one latte per month, then I'm okay if someone doesn't use it. I know they're going to be angry at me anyway, but I'm all right setting that bar there. I think that that's a really, really low minimum bar. So that's the first part. The second part is, and we'll see if this holds true or not, but the likelihood of someone with malicious intent trying to obfuscate their identity, as many people have been doing by having all sorts of proxies and VPNs and whatever else it may be to bounce around different IP addresses, the likelihood of them using a legitimate credit card, all the processing is done by Stripe as well, they do all the verification, that is now much lower. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it's going to chop out a bunch of that. And finally, and this is one of the most important things here, I have to pay for Azure API management. In fact, I have to pay for 1 million queries, $3.50. The rate limit, which is still the same as it's always been, one request every 1500 milliseconds, would allow you to do about 1.7 million queries per month. So if everyone uses this and everyone pays me $3.50 a month and everyone uses it at about, what's that going to be? Maybe at like just over half its capacity, I'm going to be net zero. Except I'm not going to be net zero because Stripe takes a slice. And then I pay for the egress bandwidth for Azure, and I pay for the table storage, and I pay for all these other things. This is not a charge to make money. And so far I haven't seen any feedback to that effect. I have seen someone say, there's going to be some dickhead who pops up and says, you're only doing this to cash in. It's like, no, it's not that. So I hope people can see why that's there. I published the blog post on this a few hours ago, just before recording this, or a few hours before recording this, and the feedback has been super, super positive so far. I've not had anything of a negative nature, and I have had people actually subscribing as well. So it's nice to know that everything, as far as I can tell, seems to work. Now, flicking through the blog post here, I've got some graphs in here that sort of show you like very linear usage of the API, and then suddenly just like whack, big amount of traffic comes up, and you can see that it's obviously not legitimate. I show, for example, some ASNs here, and it's like, why is an ASN in Thailand, so ASNs of course being the network names, every IP address belongs to an ASN, so if I see a whole bunch of different IP addresses but they all belong to the one network, there's a question about what's going on in the network. But why do we have this ASN in Thailand doing 15,500 requests in an hour over 82 different IP addresses, and then the next most popular is doing like 6,000? Like that's just not natural, organic, legitimate traffic. I actually, when I was seeing this, I really wanted to figure out what was going on. So is this botnets? Possibly not botnets insofar as they are compromised endpoints, because compromised endpoints would have a broader distribution, one would imagine, across different ASNs, different network providers. Why do I keep seeing individual network providers suddenly spiking so quickly? I got in touch with one of them that you all know of. I tweeted out, managed to speak to the CTO there, and he was awesome, and he said, look, give me the IP addresses, we'll look into this. And he came back and he gave me some feedback about what was happening. He says, all those servers were compromised. They were either running standalone VPSs, virtual private servers, or cPanel installations. Most of them are running WordPress or Drupal. I think only 2 were not running any of those. They all had malicious cron.php running. So basically, you got a whole bunch of people who stood up websites with vulnerabilities in them or crappy passwords for admin interfaces or whatever it may be. Bad actors come along, they put their own malicious script on there, and now they're literally the puppet master pulling the strings on those instances with that host. And what it then looks like is that host sending huge volumes of malicious traffic. So that was good insofar as I knew what it was, and it was good insofar as this particular ASN or network provider as it was could go through and nuke a bunch of those boxes, but it didn't really solve my problem because it wasn't just one ASN, it was dozens and dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of different ASNs. And then I'd go through and I'd block the ASN because there's a massive uptick in malicious behaviour and some legitimate person just trying to do their job can't hit the API. And then I get support emails going, hey, I can't hit the API. And then I'm like, maybe you're on a network of the bad actor. Maybe I'll remove the ASN from the firewall rule. And now the bad traffic comes back again. So you see how I was like just in this spiral, continually trying to fix problems. So firewall rules and Cloudflare are really, really good for a lot of this. The challenge is that once someone gets determined enough, firewall rules alone aren't enough. And it's an API too, so you can't really use a bunch of their anti-automation stuff. I can't just challenge, for example, because then that causes problems. Oh boy, so flicking through, this has been like my silent private pain that I've had to deal with and not talk about until I could get a good solution for it. So authenticator requests, we've covered those. There is an HIBP API key header now. So after you actually sign up for a key, you get your key, you add it to this custom header. A few people have said, why didn't you just use an authorization header? I could have. Azure API Management ships with its own custom header, which actually has, I think it's got like OCP-APIM or something weird in it, which didn't look really good. So I'm actually using a Cloudflare worker. So when you hit V3 of the API, you're actually hitting Cloudflare. Code on the edge, Cloudflare workers, totally awesome. Code on the edge will look at a whole bunch of stuff in that request. There's a few different things that I optimize and I toggle and I switch and so on. It will take that HIBP API key and it will then transpose it into the header, which Azure API Management expects. So I get an abstraction on top of that underlying Azure implementation, and I don't have to expose the frankly kind of screwy header name. It really doesn't matter if it's in an authorization header or if it's in a custom header. It is literally just a string name and a string value. Someone might argue that, well, semantically, it should be an authorization header with a bearer token. So let me tell you how much I care about semantics at this point in time. One of the things that I did change with V3 is I killed off the multiple versioning mechanisms of V2. So I wrote a blog post a long time ago about your API versioning is wrong. Because when I had to do V2 of the Have I Been Pwned API, I sort of put it out there to the Twitters and I said, well, how do you think I should do it? Should I version in the route, so literally in the URL? Should I version with a custom header? Should I version with content negotiation? Like, how should I do this? And there were lots of different ideas vehemently held. And I went, screw it, I'll just do all of them and then you choose. And 90+% of every versioned request has always put it in the URL. You know why? Because it's easy. It's easy, 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 and it works. And I don't care how much you want to vehemently argue that it should be, let's say, in a custom header or particularly in any sort of content negotiation, because that is a more semantically correct. I don't care. Stop it. This is how it works. Use it like that or don't use it. I'm okay. So, yeah, I felt better. But no, in all seriousness, I do see a lot of these debates that get enormously theoretical and academic about what is the correct way to do this. There is no functional difference. This is the easiest way. So if you were doing it other ways before in, say, version 2 of the API, put it in the URL in version 3. It's a piece of cake. It will take you about 60 seconds. So that is fine, that bit. Now, what else have I got in here that is of relevance? I spoke about the versioning just here. I will be killing version 2 of the API, and I've set a 1-month sunset clause on it. 1 month in terms of the effort required to actually make the change, and if anyone's got rich client apps and they've got to go into the App Store or something like that, that's an easy fix. It doesn't take long to actually do the code. 1 month is plenty of time to do the codes, resubmit it to the App Store, whatever else you've got to do. So I think that that's plenty of time. Of course, I could have made it longer. And in fairness, like if I get massive pushback and there's actually good reasons that I haven't misunderstood, I will make it longer. I don't think I'll need to. The reason I kept it at a month is because I do expect that the old API is probably just going to keep copying more and more abuse now that the sorts of actors that probably won't want to pay the $3.50 a month are not going to have access to it in the future. I'm just going to clamp down on that stuff. So honestly, if I see an ASN abusing this again, it's like naughty corner, that's it. There's an easy fix to this. You go and use the new API and you pay $3.50. And if you don't want to do that, just don't use it. So there's 1 month before that dies. There are a couple of switches. Wow, what's that noise out there? So one of the interesting things about being here in this apartment is I get all of this noise outside, and I'm just going to make sure my fire still works. Do I seem paranoid about the fireplace? Anyway, so there are a couple of things that do toggle, a couple of switches which are inverted from what they were before. Now, one of those was truncate response. So I had, by default, when you queried the API, you would get back, let's say you queried it for my email address, you would get back a response which had every single data breach that I had appeared in, and then all the metadata and everything about the data breach. They're big responses. So you'd get Adobe, and then the date of the breach and how many records were in it, and then the full description, and then a list of all the data classes that were impacted. They were big responses. And what I actually did in V2 is I added this truncate response query string parameter. And if you use this, instead of getting all of the metadata, you would just get the name of the breach, Adobe. That's it. You get Adobe. You get, what else have I been in? Houzz, LinkedIn, Dropbox, all these things. That's about 98% smaller, the response size. Egress bandwidth is increasingly expensive for me because of the way the volumes have gone up. So what I've done is I've toggled it, and by default now you will get a truncated response. You can get a full response if you want to. I could have just not even given that option, just said no, you only get a title. But I wanted to make sure people that had already invested in this didn't have to go and do too much more work. If you just get the title, if you just get Adobe, there is another public API endpoint that still doesn't require auth, still doesn't have any rate limits on it, it's just cached really aggressively at Cloudflare, where you can query it for either the name of a data breach or just give me all the data breaches, and you get the 370 something odd that are in there. So you can sort of load that up in a memory, and then as you're querying accounts, just go, hey Adobe, can you get me the full data for that? And Dropbox, get me the full data for that, just from memory. So it's much, 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 much more efficient for you and for me. So that inverted. The other one that inverted is there's an include unverified parameter. And the rationale here is I introduced the concept of unverified data breaches a few years ago. So they were breaches where the data was legitimate insofar as they were real people's names, real email addresses, all this sort of thing, but I couldn't verify it as coming from the source that it allegedly came from. And at the time, I sort of went out there and I asked people, I said, what should I do? And it all boiled down to, look, you should still load it, but indicate that it's unverified. I didn't want to start feeding that into the API because there are all these people that built dependencies on the API expecting the data to be verified, and then I'd feed this in and it's like, well, actually, no, it's, now there's stuff in there which is not verified. The reason I've ended up inverting this is because I've had so many times where someone says, hey, I searched on the front page of Have I Been Pwned and I get this result set, and then I use the API and I get a different result set. Why is it? Well, it's because of the thing that's in the documentation. It's the flag, but because people don't read the documentation, I get support queries. So I've inverted that. I don't think it will actually matter too much because the amount of unverified stuff in there is really small. All right, so there's all that. Now, moving on to keys. Problems that used to be mine are now yours, if you're an API consumer. And let me explain what I mean by that. The problem that used to be mine was controlling the volume of requests. So I set a very simple rate limit. People would circumvent it with multiple IP addresses. This, so long as I've got my key provisioning right, and it's not sort of provisioned by bad people doing bad things, this fixes the problem. The problem now is, like, let's say you're an app developer and you've got an app and you want to make sure that people can use it legitimately but not illegitimately. You now need to be the one that makes sure that someone is not just hammering away at your API, which then proxies through to my API, I'll talk about proxies in a moment, smashes out your rate limit, and then you're not able to actually use the system properly by anyone else. In fact, let's talk about proxies now, because otherwise this is going to seem a little bit weird. That API key that you get from Have I Been Pwned is a secret. You will need to protect it. If other people get it, they can make requests to the API using your rate limit, and then you won't be able to make requests because they'll smash your rate limit out. So you need to figure out how you protect your key. If you're running a script from your desktop to enumerate through your colleagues in the office, then that's fine, it's just on your desktop. If you're running a web application and you're going to put it somewhere in your config file of your web application, then that's fine, that's a secret. If you are pushing out a rich client app to multiple different external parties, then you've got a problem insofar as you can't ship that key out. They get the key, you've got a problem. So I've spoken a little bit in here about how to do things like proxying with a Cloudflare worker. If you've got an app that you want to push out to other people, it is dead simple to stand up a Cloudflare worker. It will cost you about $5 a month. Stand up that worker, make all the requests come to the Cloudflare worker, put your key, your HIBP API key, in the worker, and then route those requests through to my endpoint. So that fixes the problem of not disclosing your key, but still being able to have external parties hit the API. Your challenge then is what happens if they start abusing your API? Because every request they make to your API is then going to go onto my API. So this is where it's now your problem. You have to figure out how you're going to limit the abuse of your API rather than you and the 1,000 other people just like you all just going, we're just going to hit Troy's API as hard as we can, and I have 1,000 problems. You now just have one problem. So ways you can do that are things like I did with Cloudflare in terms of using rate limits, etc. You may have accounts that your customers need to create. There are other things you can do around anti-automation as well, for example. So there's lots of different things that you can do to try and reduce this problem, but it does shift the burden from me to you, which, if I'm honest, it does actually seem kind of fair. You know, like, why should I be the one that has to deal with the fact that your endpoints keep getting abused? So hopefully that's not going to happen en masse, but that is an important distinction to understand. All right, what else have we got in here? So I've given you all the code for the Cloudflare worker. There are 29 lines in total, including the spaces, the curly braces, and the comments. So there's actually probably about 12 lines worth of code in here to do this. You can copy and paste it. I've already had people saying this is awesome. So great, go and do that because it's simple. I've already had suggestions or requests rather around things like, what if we're an open source project or not for profit? Can we get it for free? Well, no, you can't because I have to pay for it. So if you're asking me to donate to your charity, which is effectively what it's asking for, that's a little bit different to, the way this actually works. So again, this is to be really clear. This fee is not there for me to make money out of it. It's to try and limit the abuse, and it's to try and cover the costs, and that's it. So I can't see any situation in which someone pops up and says, can you give this to me for free, which makes sense, particularly since it's $3.50. You will find $3.50, and if you can't, or if it's not worth it, then it's not worth it. Just don't do it. It just seems like a simple thing to me. Too early yet to know how all that feedback's going to be. Now, a couple of other things here. If I'm honest, my plan A was that I wanted to have this live before I left Australia more than 6 weeks ago. That was plan A. And I got so busy doing so much stuff before coming away on this trip and the whole Project Svalbard and everything, I just didn't get the time to do it. I had probably 50% of it written. And I've just absolutely smashed out the hours on the last week, making sure it's ready, doing a whole bunch of beta testing over the last couple of days with a bunch of people who offered their time, so thank you for those people. And finally getting it to the point where it is sufficient to go to production. Now, by sufficient, I mean you can pay with a credit card, all the billing and everything works right, you get the key works, everything's functional. There are rough edges that I would like to improve. So for example, there's no way to rotate your key at the moment. Don't lose your key. Don't disclose your key to someone else. I don't have a mechanism of rotating it. I do intend to have that in the future. Support. I am not guaranteeing support for this because of all the time problems I just mentioned. Unless I have screwed something up in terms of the way the billing or the key provisioning or something works, and if I have, I want to know about that because I want to fix that stuff. I'm not going to be able to sit there and answer your questions about how do you consume an API with a key. Like, the documentation is super clear, the implementation is super clear, but time and time again over recent years, I just had people asking me the simplest questions. And I'm not trying to be derogatory about them. I'm just trying to illustrate how I simply don't have the bandwidth to deal with these. Sometimes there'll be things like someone says, I'm consuming your API, I'm running into a problem, and I'll say, okay, well, can you show me the response body you're receiving? And they'll say, here's my code. So no, I don't care about your code. I don't care if it's PHP or whatever else it is. You can use whatever you want. I care about the response body because the response body has debug information in it. How do you get the response body? If you don't know how to get the response body from an API, go to like Stack Overflow or somewhere like that. I cannot stretch myself enough to answer everyone's questions about response bodies and things. So it is super simple. I can't do support at that level. Please let me know if anything goes wrong with billing, key provisioning, rate limiting, any of that. I do want to know about that stuff. And that's it. That is what has happened with this API. And I'm very anxiously watching the adoption rates of it and the fact that it actually does what I expect it to do in terms of how the rate limiting and everything works. I'm also closely watching requests to the old API. And as I said before, when I see abuse to it, I'm clamping down on that very early. And if anyone gets inadvertently caught up in that, here's the new one. And I apologize if that puts anyone under duress they didn't expect to be. I've certainly have not designed it in order to force people over, but I can't keep having this situation where people are standing up gazillions of IP addresses on compromised web shells and on someone's ASN. Like that's just crazy that I have to be the one that supports that. So that is that. Last thing this week is sponsorship is again by Shape Security. They're talking about capture no longer being enough. Shape Connect blocks automation improves security instantly with a 30-minute implementation, which is probably pretty relevant to the whole thing we've been discussing here about trying to actually solve some of the problems of automation as well. Those guys really do some quite amazing stuff. They're certainly one of the leaders when it comes to how you actually make sure that things like transactions are legitimate and authentication attempts are legitimate. There is a lot more to figuring out what is a bot and what is a human than just throwing captures and this sort of thing at people. And those guys do have some super cool technology. So big thanks to Shape for the sponsorship this week. So that is that for now. This has been a massive, massive week with the data breaches, the pwn passwords, the API management stuff, all the Svelbar stuff. Next week is just going to be meetings. It is going to be absolutely insane. If you're around San Fran, I may need some beer at some time next week and the week after, so let me know. And hopefully I have some cool updates, and I'll tell you as much as I can possibly tell you when I get to do the video from San Fran next week. Thanks very much for watching.